Welcome to Uncle Bert's radio broadcast. This radio show was broadcast by the United States Department of Agriculture in 1926. Disclaimer: this is read from a historic archive document. Do not assume contents reflects current scientific knowledge, policies, or practices. This broadcast was aired on the 17th of March, 1926.
Dear boys and girls of the radio audience, this is Uncle Bert, the garden expert of the United States Department of Agriculture, broadcasting information about gardening, particularly for boys and girls. This is the third talk of this series. However, if you missed the first two broadcasts, you may obtain printed copies by writing to this station. Last week we talked about starting early plants in the house, and this week we will answer some of the questions about hotbeds and cold frames. What is a hotbed anyway? Long before greenhouses were invented, pits or hotbeds were used for growing plants during the winter or early spring. These were pits in the ground, which were partially filled with fermenting leaves, or compost, to supply the heat, and covered by sash with glass in them. Usually a few inches of soil was spread over the fermenting compost, and the seeds of flowers and vegetables sown in this soil. Today, we have what are known as standard hotbed sash, which are 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, and these are used for covering the beds. Hotbeds are made with one or more sashes. The length of the bed depends on the number of sashes used. For the home garden, a 2-sash hotbed is about right. That is, the pit and the frame of boards around it will be 6 by 6 feet in size. Where should the hotbed be located? First of all, where it will get plenty of sunshine and be protected from the cold wind. Sometimes it can be located on the south side of the garage or even attached to the house. Pits or hotbeds attached to the house may sometimes be heated from the furnace or hot water heater that furnishes the heat for the dwelling. Can hotbeds be heated by electricity? Yes, indeed, and that is the ideal way to heat them. Make the pit just as you would for heating with compost, but with a floor of boards or flat tiles about a foot below the lower or south side of the pit, and then place an electric hot plate near the bottom of the pit, or about 18 inches below the floor. 2 or 3 40-watt electric lamps screwed in sockets fastened to a base will furnish enough heat for a small bed, but the hot plate is more effective. Care must be taken to have the wiring well insulated and protected from the dampness of the bed. This idea of heating plant beds by electricity is a new one and worth trying, especially where electricity is already being used for cooking or household heating purposes. What should be the temperature of a plant bed? That depends on what plants are being grown. Tomatoes, peppers, and eggplant do best at about 70 or 72 degrees, while cabbage, cauliflower, and lettuce want a temperature about 8 or 10 degrees lower. Too much heat is harmful. The bed must be ventilated and the heat cut off when the sun is bright. Here is where the electric or hot water heating has the advantage over the compost, for it can be shut off in daytime when no heat is needed. What are cold frames? Cold frames are simply hotbeds without any heat except that furnished by the sun's rays. Cold frames are covered with glass, the same as hotbeds, but are constructed without a pit. They usually consist of a framework of boards 18 inches high at the back or north side and about 8 inches high at the front or south side. Earth is banked around the frames to keep out the cold, and on very cold nights, an old rug or piece of canvas is thrown over the glass for additional protection. Cold frames are used to harden off the plants grown in the house or hotbed before setting them in the garden. Early lettuce, radishes, and beets can be grown ready for the table in a cold frame. Remember, boys and girls of the Radio Garden Club, that both hotbeds and cold frames require careful attention to watering and ventilation. If the plants in the hotbed or cold frames are watered too heavily, or the water is dashed upon them with a hose, they are certain to be broken. Besides, a disease known as damping is liable to destroy them if watered improperly. The best method is to use a small sprinkling can and apply merely enough water to keep the soil from becoming dry. Watering should be done during the day so that the plants will become dry before the sun goes down. The ventilation of a hotbed or cold frame is really just as important as the watering. If you should hurry to school in the morning and forget to ventilate the bed and the sun comes out bright and warm, the plants may be almost scalded before noontime. In ventilating a hotbed or cold frame, simply raise the sashes a little on the side opposite the direction that the wind is coming from, so that the wind will blow over the opening and draw out the warm air rather than to blow directly into the bed. Small pieces of boards with notches cut in their sides are the best for holding the sash up, or small blocks of wood can be used for this purpose. In cool weather, the sashes should always be lowered before evening in order to conserve the heat of the bed to carry it through the night. Later, as the weather warms and the nights are not so frosty, the bed can be left open a greater portion of the time, and toward the end of the period, after the plants are about ready to plant in the garden, the sashes can be removed from the bed entirely and only put on as needed in case of frost at night. If standard hotbed sash 3 by 6 feet in size cannot be secured, regular window sash will do. Substitutes for glass may be used, but they are not as satisfactory as glass. How many of the boys and girls of the Radio Garden Club have started making a plan for a garden? It does seem useless to make this plan, but on the other hand, how are you going to know what you can plant in your garden unless you draw a plan? That brings up the question of what crops to grow, and that all depends upon what you're going to do with the products of the garden. If the garden is for home use, you will want considerable variety. If for canning, you may perhaps want tomatoes and tomatoes only, or at most tomatoes and either snap beans or sweet corn. Some of the girls in the South have made enough money growing and canning pimento peppers to pay their way through college. Early tomatoes trained to stakes are usually quite profitable, giving a return of about 50 cents a plant. Peppers are often very profitable. Well-grown head lettuce, beets, carrots, and radishes all give large returns for the space occupied. Golden bantam corn, while less profitable, is greatly in demand and creates a market for other vegetables. Find out what your market most needs in the way of vegetables at the time that you can supply them. Right now is the time to work the plan all out on paper, deciding the number of feet of row of each crop, the distance between rows, and the quantity of seed and fertilizer for each vegetable. What are the main points, aside from market and home demands, to consider in making a plan for a garden? First of all, sunlight and exposure are most important. Most garden vegetables want all the sunshine that it is possible to secure. The longest shadows are cast during the early morning and late evening. By placing the taller growing crops at the north side of the garden and running the rows east and west, each plant will receive a maximum of sunlight, provided there are no buildings, trees, or high fences to cut off the sunlight. Pole beans, corn, peas, and staked tomatoes are among the taller of the garden crops, therefore should be on the north side of the garden. Lettuce, radishes, spinach, onions, beets, carrots, snap beans, and cabbages are among the lower growing plants of the garden, so they should be planted to the south of the tall crops. Lettuce, spinach, radishes, and onions may be grown close together in beds if space is limited, while beets, carrots, snap beans, dwarf lima beans, cabbage, and potatoes require more space. The bulletins which are sent to the members of the Radio Garden Club who request them give the planting distances of all the vegetables. Most of the smaller vegetables can be planted in rows 18 inches apart. Cabbage, cauliflower, potatoes, and bush beans require that the rows be at least 28 or 30 inches apart in order that the rows will not crowd each other. Where in the garden should summer squashes, muskmelons, and cucumbers be planted? These crops, and also tomatoes that are allowed to grow naturally on the ground, should be located next to the pole beans, corn, and other tall crops. Late squashes can be planted in the corn and take the place of the corn after the ears are removed and the fodder cut away. What are succession crops in gardening? Succession crops are those that follow another on the same ground, as for instance late cabbage after early beans or peas, mid-season beans after early lettuce and spinach. A succession of plantings means the making of 3 or 4 plantings of the same crop at intervals of 10 days or 2 weeks, so as to lengthen the season of marketing that crop. The same result can often be obtained by planting 3 or 4 carefully selected varieties at or about the same time. The boys and girls who are following this series should by all means send for a copy of the bulletin, which contains directions for laying out a garden. Next week, we will answer questions regarding the preparation of the soil of the garden. Nothing is to be gained by planting garden crops before the soil is reasonably warm, but it is now time to plant peas, potatoes, radishes, beets, and lettuce in many of the north-central sections. So the boys and girls must make haste to prepare their garden plans and order seeds. This is your Uncle Bert's 3rd talk from this station. As the spring approaches closer, this garden expert is going to give the boys and girls, at least those who are interested in the fascinating sport of gardening by radio, additional hints that will help them in growing profitable garden crops. Please tell your boy and girl friends who have radios about this gardening club and your new Uncle Bert. Ask them to write in for a membership card so that they may have copies of talks and ether printed information on gardening available from the Department of Agriculture. Write this station and your request will be forwarded to Uncle Bert in Washington, D.C. Until next time, remember to giddy up and garden.
This production was researched and produced by BreakAway Empire LLC.